Hello everybody and welcome back to the Ultimate Fashion History for an Ultimate Fashion History special feature. One of my favorite topics, fashion and the good neighbor policy. So jump into my time machine with me and let's go back to the 1940s. Let's go back to World War II. Now we all know about 40s fashion, don't we? Pick up any fashion history textbook and they will quite rightly tell you that fashion in the 40s, in the war years, was really broken into four distinct camps: utility wear, uniforms, workwear, and of course that high glamour 1940s golden age of Hollywood look. Sure, these four concepts really are the main fashion story, but I always think that when fashion history is taught, it is really only ever taught in terms of overarching concepts, and in terms of the 20th century, often passing trends are overlooked. When you think of fashion history, I think of it as a novel, a fabulous story, and in the story of fashion history, trends are the subplots. So the world at war. Of course, World War II started in 1939 when that nasty little man with his rather unusual mustache invaded Poland. But of course, America went into the war with the bombing of Pearl Harbor in December 1941. This, of course, was Roosevelt's famous speech: "We are now in this war, we are all in it all the way." Well, sure, we were all in it, but what about South America? What about Central America? They were undeclared at the onset of World War II, and it was vital, absolutely vital, that the Allies got Central America and South America on our side. Not only because we needed them on our side, we did not want Mexico and Argentina and Brazil to go over to the Axis as if they ever would, but also think about trade and travel. It was extremely important that Roosevelt opened up Central America and South America, which he did with this wonderful piece of propaganda named the Good Neighbor Policy. Look at this: strengthen the good neighbor policy, understand our southern neighbors. Now you have to remember that in the early 1940s, America had little or no interest in Mexico and South America. It was going through a Great Depression, wasn't it? It had other things to think about. Now, there had always been a Pan-American agreement. That was started by Coolidge, I believe, in sort of 1919. So we could always trade and travel within Central and Latin America, but we really need to glamorize it when we get into World War II. And Roosevelt did this brilliantly with the cutely named Good Neighbor Policy. Take a look at this piece of propaganda: Americans all, let's fight for victory. And you see the sombrero being raised next to Uncle Sam's top hat. This idea that it wasn't just North America and Canada being part of the Allies, but that Latin America, Central America were allies too, which of course they became. But boy, this was spun as one of the biggest propagandist movements in World War II. For the same victory, Mexico. What a wonderful piece of art there. I love this. Good neighbors join our fight. 14 million Hitler-hating Brazilians are on our side. And the caption there reads: Brazilians love to ridicule the trick Hitler mustaches, the swastika and bigwig pomposity of the Hitler-Mussolini Hirohito Club. Americans were encouraged to travel to Latin America. Look at this carnival in Rio. Chile, a friendly country. The land Columbus loved most, the Dominican Republic, because of course the Caribbean was part of the whole good neighbor policy thing. Resources of Brazil, products she contributes to defeat the Axis. Mexico was really sold as sort of an alternative to Europe. Old world charm was really at the heart of the Mexican sell. People were encouraged to go on cruises to South America, see the Americas first. Meet Latin gaiety, old world charm in lovely, light-hearted Cuba. It's so funny that 10 years after the war, probably less than 10 years after the war, Cuba didn't suddenly seem so light-hearted, did it? But certainly during the 40s, it was sold as a place of tremendous sexiness and fun and frolics. And of course, Latin America and the Caribbean and Mexico were relatively close to North America, Havana just 5 hours away. So just as people in the United States had to be sold on the idea of Latin America had to be sold on the USA. And Roosevelt did something really quite brilliant. He sent one of America's most beloved people down to Central America and Latin America to do a sort of goodwill tour and be an ambassador for all good things American. And of course, this guy was supposed to come back with product as well. He sent this guy. Do you recognize him? Of course you do. Walt Disney. He sent Walt Disney and a group of Disney's artists, animators, writers, and composers down to Latin America to visit nearly every country as part of a goodwill tour, but also to do research to create products that would then help sell South America to North Americans. There is Walt embarking on his epic journey with his wife and just some of the team he took with him, who were known as El Grupo, the group, when they arrived in Latin America. And of course, Walt Disney was completely swamped wherever he went, because who doesn't love Walt Disney? Every generation loved Walt Disney, and it was really kind of brilliant of Roosevelt to choose him as one of the artists he sent as part of the good neighbor policy. And Walt Disney absolutely embraced it. He really, really did. Here he is, I think in Argentina, learning some Latin dances, some traditional folk dances. Here is Walt making like a gaucho, and so many of these experiences actually did make it into Disney movies. As you can see here, there's Goofy making like a gaucho. What I find was so interesting about Walt Disney's goodwill tour of Latin America is that he didn't let any of his artists take cameras. Isn't that fascinating? He wanted them to sketch what they saw, to paint what they saw. He felt that that was far more urgent and far more real and far more evocative of the spirit of these various nations than if they just took photographs and then reproduced the photographs once back in Burbank. And here is a Disney artist doing just that, painting some wonderful rainforest here. I absolutely adore this picture, this photograph, for so many reasons. One of them is that it's color, which, is, as you know, is quite rare for candid shots in the 1940s. This is a young artist who was part of the Disney junket. Her name is Mary Blair. She was a very junior artist with Disney. I think she was just an animation colorist, actually. Her husband, Lee Blair, was far more important as an artist, and he was on the junket as well. But Disney saw something in young Mary Blair, who, by the way, is incredibly trendy, as you can see here, and took her along, and her work actually really informed a lot of the product that he ultimately produced. Take a look at her here, sketching these Chilean ladies in national dress, in traditional attire, and then look at her sketch. Now, if that looks familiar to you, it might be because you've been to either Disneyland or Disney World, because Mary Blair would go on to be one of the most important people with the Disney Corporation and actually designed It's a Small World, that wonderful ride. But more about Mary Blair in a second. So, of course, Disney had to bring back product, which he did with the wonderful movie Saludos Amigos. Walt Disney Goes South American in his gayest musical Technicolor feature. It's absolutely wonderful. If you haven't seen it, please try to watch it. It's got such beautiful animation. The other movie that was generated from this junket was The Three Caballeros, which of course is tremendous fun, and again really sold the idea of our good neighbors to the south being friendly and wonderful and colorful neighbors, which of course they are.
The whole story is told in this wonderful documentary, Walt and El Grupo. It's beautiful. I highly recommend it.
So Disney's trip to South America was a tremendous success. Less successful was when Roosevelt sent this guy, Orson Welles. He was supposed to do the same kind of thing and come back with a wonderful propagandist movie that would sell the United States on Latin America. However, Orson, being Orson, didn't quite come up with the goods that Roosevelt hoped. He came up with a wonderful movie, however. There he is on location. His movie was called It's All True, and it sort of focused more on factory workers and things like that. That was not the idea. No, Latin America was the home of the salsa and the samba and sexy people doing glamorous things. Not what Orson came back with, but it's still a wonderful movie. Not quite as joyful as Saludos Amigos, however. The good neighbor policy was on film everywhere, though, on Hollywood movies. Down Argentine Way, Road to Rio, Rio Rita, That Night in Rio. I could go on and on. And I will. Mexican Hayride, Weekend in Havana. Gilda, of course, was set in Argentina. Now remember, the good neighbor policy actually continued sort of into the early 1950s. There was still a kind of craze about South America. And although Gilda actually came out after the war had ended, it still has that good neighbor policy feel to it. Now Voyager, my favorite movie, as many of you know. This is interesting. I count it as a good neighbor policy movie, even though most of it is set in Boston. In the original book, Now Voyager, Charlotte Vale, the heroine, has her transformative cruise around the Mediterranean. However, in the 1942 movie, Bette Davis and Paul Henreid have a cruise around the Caribbean and down to South America. So I really think that Now Voyager counts as a good neighbor policy movie. And I think it's very interesting how the location of that cruise was changed just to incorporate the good neighbor policy and do a bit of a propagandist hard sell. Speaking of Now Voyager, I know, I am still working on the Ultimate Fashion Histories Fave Film Fashion Now Voyager video. It's my favorite movie, and Ori Kelly's costumes really tell the story of this woman's life and her feelings and her coming of age. And because I can't screw it up, because it's my favorite movie, I'm still working on it. It's a hard one. It's like looking at the sun. You daren't do it. Anyway, digression alert. Let's get back to fashion and the good neighbor policy. Just as in movies, in music, South America and the good neighbor policy was heard on the American and International Hit Parade, with songs like South of the Border, Down Mexico Way, Rum and Coca-Cola, opening line, If You Ever Go to Trinidad. I mean, we all know what that song's really about, but still, it had that good neighbor policy Caribbean vibe to it. The Coffee Song by Frank Sinatra. You all know that one. Way down among Brazilians, coffee beans grow by the billions, so they've got a lot of extra cups to fill. They've got an awful lot of coffee in Brazil. And my favorite, South America, Take It Away, which actually makes fun of the good neighbor policy. If you haven't heard this song, go listen to it or bring up the lyrics by Bing Crosby and the Andrews Sisters. It really does make fun of the good neighbor policy and this relentless sell. And of course, there were stars who came about because of the good neighbor policy. Latin Americans, Central Americans who absolutely enchanted North America and the rest of the world during the war years and beyond. People like Xavier Cugat, the band leader, who conducted with his pet chihuahua. Desi Arnaz. Before Desi and Lucy, there was Desi Arnaz, a star in his own right, as a band leader and singer and performer. And of course, the incomparably sexy Ricardo Montalban. But come on, the biggest Good Neighbor policy star, of course, was Carmen Miranda, this beautiful Brazilian who really embodied everything that we were told to love about Latin America. She was funny, she was sexy, she was fun, she was all good things. And these stars really did bring this sort of Latin American glamour and gaiety to a very troubled and frightened and anxious North America and other allied nations. Do you know there was a radio show on CBS that ran throughout the war years that focused only on Latin American music and stars? It came live from various Latin American countries. And so every week Americans could tune in and really be transported to Rio de Janeiro or Buenos Aires and escape rationing and uncertainty and the fear of those awful telegrams telling you that your loved one was missing in action or worse. Of course, the Good Neighbor policy was manifest in homeware. Let's take a look at the Casa and see just some of the many Latin-inspired Good Neighbor policy junk that people loved during World War II, like these wall plaques here. Look at this letter holder, or these bookends. I love this condiment set. And look at this Carmen Miranda-esque planter. Or that one there. Boy, I'd love to have that. Sometimes everything was spun in a cutesy way, sometimes in a more authentic way. Sometimes in just a weird anamorphic way, like these banana salt and pepper shakers wearing sombreros. So weird. But of course, the south of the border sombrero ashtray was seen everywhere. But just look at how bizarre this is. It's a sombrero souvenir ashtray from Florida. At least Florida is known for its sunshine, unlike Seattle. But you can see the Good Neighbor policy had no national boundaries. A Seattle sombrero, why not? Sometimes homeware was a little bit more authentic and spoke to pre-Columbian South America, like this rather exotic, primitive, Inca-looking, Aztec-looking planter here. Of course, toys, children were on board with the Good Neighbor policy. I love this paper doll book here, the Good Neighbor paper dolls. There they are, these lovely senoritas looking out of their window, and there they are in rather sexy versions of Mexican national dress. There were Good Neighbor policy dolls. Look at this little rattle with a kind of Carmen Miranda figure. And this rather depressed looking marionette with his serape stripe shawl. Food as well, my goodness, every kitchen became a cantina in North America during the war years, it seemed. Mexican cookery for American homes. Van Camp's delicious Mexican-style foods for a fiesta of good eating. Isn't that a beautiful piece of illustrative art? Finest way to lend a fiesta air to everyday fare. I don't know if that sad-looking chicken, is it pork? I don't know what it is on a bed of peas. I don't see much fiesta gaiety there. But look, the whole thing has been photographed on a serape stripe tablecloth. Every nightlife and nightclubs, well, hello, of course, the Copacabana Club. There it is on East 60th Street. Tying in with the Good Neighbor policy, and look at the menu there with that Carmen Miranda character. La Marimba Club in San Francisco. Rio Cabana at the Concord Hotel, New York. Saludos amigos. We invite you to enjoy yourself at the Macambo in Edmonton, Alberta. And I love this, the Monterey Cocktail Room. They have just stuck a Mexican postcard to their menus to give themselves the élan of Latin glamour. Of course, graphic art took a trip to South America as well. Look at this Valentine's card. Rather see you than say siesta. Be mine, please. That makes no sense to me on any level, but you can see it's good neighbor policy. Happy birthday, big boy. That's weird. And the most depressing Christmas card of all time. Christmas greetings, brother. But you can see the sombrero ashtray there. And look at this Christmas ornament. Oh my goodness, I would love this. All right, now that I have explained, in probably too much depth, just what a huge trend Central America and South America was because of the good neighbor policy in World War II, let's look at fashion and the trends that came about in the early 1940s to mid-1940s and sometimes beyond because of the good neighbor policy. The souvenir jacket. The embroidered Mexican felt souvenir jacket was a huge fashion trend. Here is the front and here is the back. Isn't that fabulous? So many people had a version of this. It was cool, it was cheap, it was trendy, it was patriotic because it was part of the good neighbor policy. It was great fun, and I always think when it comes to 1940s fashion, World War II fashion particularly, there was so much fun and so much whimsy and playfulness because of course fashion was used as such a tremendous escape from the very real worries. Look, here is a McCall's pattern, printed pattern with transfer, so you could applique the embroidery upon the felt jacket after you made it. Here is just a book of transfers. Mexicana, 32 motifs for household linen, so you could iron a bit of Mexico onto your tea towels. And here's a wonderful picture of a lady looking very pretty with her gloves and her hat and her souvenir jacket. The peasant skirt, of course, either tiered or not tiered, often with Mexican or Latin American motifs. Incredibly popular in the 1940s because of the good neighbor policy. Here are so many versions. Of course, they are all teamed with peasant blouses, which we'll be looking at in a second. Absolutely gorgeous. And again, take a look here. It's the peasant blouse with the peasant skirt, but in a far more chic, high fashion rendering. And please note the midriff on the model on the right. Of course, showing your tummy was extremely trendy and very popular in the 1940s. It had never been done before. And here is a very high fashion rendering of the peasant skirt and peasant blouse. The peasant blouse, either embroidered or not, was an enormous fashion trend in the 1940s. People hadn't worn peasant blouses before, unless they actually wore them as part of their traditional attire south of the border. But my goodness, were they popular in the 40s. Here are some images of various stars wearing peasant blouses. Now, they are not in costume. This was just very trendy streetwear. And who's that? That's Mary Blair, Disney's Mary Blair, who was extremely trendy herself, wearing not only a peasant blouse, but what looks like a Mexican peasant skirt, and a wonderful piece of Mexican silver there on her wrist. And of course, it goes without saying that serape stripe became extremely popular in the war years as well. Take a look at this absolutely adorable play suit from the 1940s. Look at this skirt. Not exactly serape stripe, but certainly playing with the idea. As is this. Isn't that a fabulous fashion image? God, I love fashion. I love clothes. The pre-Columbian world also made an appearance in fashion in the war years, like this beautiful Inca, Aztec, Mayan looking jacket here, and of course a lot of Aztec, Inca, Mayan looking jewelry. And of course you see the good neighbor policy everywhere in print of the 1940s, like these wonderful sombreros here and these abstract cacti. And look at the print on this two-piece bathing costume. Or what about the sombreros here on this dress? And do note the shoulder pads, of course. We're in the 40s here. As many of you know, I love accessories above all things, and accessories in the 40s were at their very best. Why? Because accessories were not rationed. Why not? Maybe you know if you watched my UFH on the 1940s. Roosevelt decided not to ration accessories, and that included hats, jewelry, shoes, ties, etc., because he wanted to boost morale, and women were doing such a great job during the war. He wanted to give them their treat, which was accessories, and boy oh boy, accessories embrace the good neighbor policy. Don't you love this? The Pan American brooch. Look at this lovely Bakelite pin, or this one here, or this one here. I want Bakelite in my life. I need more Bakelite. I need this Bakelite banana necklace. And I really need this beautiful Mexican charm bracelet with guitars and sombreros. When it came to footwear, of course, the good neighbor policy was perfect. It was the era of the espadrille. Shoes were not rationed, they counted as accessories. And so we get an awful lot of espadrilles, an awful lot of sandals. And look, an entire Mexican village in the heel of your shoe. Again, I would love to have those shoes. And menswear too. Of course, most men were in uniform of one kind or another during World War II, but in their civvies, there was room for the good neighbor policy. Look at the back of this shirt. Look at this tie. And look at this tie pin. I always like to show pictures of real people, snapshots, when discussing fashion history, so that it's not all just high fashion images. And here are some lovely pictures of regular people who have embraced the good neighbor policy. And this is my favorite. Look, there's grandma with a little grandchild, and she has gone the full amigo, hasn't she? She's got the peasant blouse, she's got the tiered peasant skirt. So it was a huge trend, and it really happened. But what happened to the good neighbor policy? Well, peace. The war ended. So in the 1950s, the attention culturally in pop culture shifted, didn't it? From South America to somewhere else. Thor Heyerdahl's Kon-Tiki expedition found the world enchanted with the idea of Polynesia, and this wonderful Latin gaiety was replaced by sexy sarongs, Hawaiian shirts, Polynesian prints. The other cultural hotspot in the 1950s, of course, was Paris. And again, we see the trend for Central America and South America replaced with things like poodle skirts. The poodle comes from Paris, doesn't it? The French poodle. And the birth of rock and roll saw skirts like this. The world had changed. Trends do change. They come and they go, and they sometimes come back. But generally they come back in such a different form that they are unrecognizable. However, Latin America as an influence on fashion is still with us. It always has been. Think about Vivienne Westwood's Buffalo collection of the early 1980s that drew absolutely from Andean traditional dress. And here's Galliano with his Latin American collection. Isn't it sumptuous? Runway often goes back to Latin America and Central America for inspiration, like with these wonderful gaucho pants. And here's another Andean-inspired runway look. But on a more mainstream level, serape stripe is still with us, and let's look at some street-style images, purloined without permission from various blogs. Peasant dresses and peasant blouses, serape stripe. I think we probably all have a little good neighbor policy in our wardrobes, don't we? My favorite recent homage to South America was probably Dolce & Gabbana's. If any of you want to pick me up a little gift, I'd like this. I hope you've enjoyed this episode on the Ultimate Fashion History. You can contact me through my website, amandahalley.com. Like us on Facebook, as they say. Better yet, join our Facebook group. We always have loads of fun over there. Stay up to date with new episodes. Simply click the little bell under the channel art, then click Send Me Notifications, because I'm back every week with new episodes, but first you have to click that little circle to subscribe. And as always, thanks ever so much for watching. Bye for now.